Hi, I'm Molly Jo Burke.
And I'm Nathan Gorgen.
And we're Byproduct Studios. And we're showing here at the Weston Gallery, and our show is Perceptions of a Material's Purpose, and it's on view until March 3rd, 2024. Nate and I, we're both artists independently and have a background in art and design. But when we had our first child, it was, it's a big life change.
We had always been kind of interested in collaborating, and I think once we had a kid, it became more important just because we were finding that we just didn't really have time to work on our own. So in order to stay productive, we decided to collaborate. That way we could both motivate each other to get into the studio, and then also, not have to worry about one or the other of our artistic careers sort of stagnating while the other person went off and did their thing.
We started with the remnants of our studio practices. Like, Nate had noticed that as part of his position, there were all these leftover really nice pieces of wood and different components there. And then in my glass practice and my other ways of making, I tend to have a lot of remnants. And so what we started to do was use those leftover moments, and also a moment of sustainability, kind of thinking about like not just throwing it away, but kind of reworking it. But we did kind of have this like interesting way of being like, I have an idea for this piece, and then we would talk about it, and then that person's the lead, and then we kind of go back and forth. And that's the way our collaboration has really worked, is like, I don't know, just being really clear about communication.
My background was in painting, and then I sort of shifted from that into sculpture and woodworking. So I think I brought some of that sensibility to the work that we do.
Yeah, I think that so for me, I bring kind of glass and more working with fluid materials more, and also a lot of mold making experience from my ceramics background. And so I have a really great understanding of fabrication with three-dimensional materials, but I don't work with wood as frequently as Nate does. And I would say that my impulse towards making is a little bit more impulsive and intuitive and kind of feeling what the material is doing. I would say that there's a lot more planning that has to happen with the processes that we really work with on your end, which is great for me because I don't really want to have to deal with that as much. But I think that what happens is that we are able to challenge each other. That's the best part of our collaboration, is that we are able to have that conversation about what's working really well with what somebody else did and be like, can you take it a little further?
I think our collaboration has changed. I think in the beginning, as Molly mentioned, it was kind of rules-based collaboration, and we had, I think, consciously laid down like a plan, but over time, I think that mechanism becomes, it's not that we don't still have some rules, but it's definitely relaxed a lot. It's like over time, we've gotten used to working with each other and anticipating to some extent what the other person is going to want to do. And also like just knowing when the other person is like clearly on a roll and you can like just back off and like let them take over kind of. And so that's become way more intuitive now. And it's like we still have the rules, but we rarely use them, I think. The found object work, most of that in here is, we've been working in this kind of way for a while. I think when we started it, the found objects for us were more like material from, as we mentioned before, like material from our individual practices that we would like bring into, we would each bring some stuff into the collaboration, and then we would.
And those weren't even always actually found objects. They were just more like reused materials.
Yeah.
Because we had a smaller house, we were working in this environment where our kids were sometimes coming in to play a little bit more, and it'd be like, well, there's a block in the middle of my piece now.
Yeah.
And I think that there was something so playful about them mimicking our arrangements. But I think that there was this moment where this inclusion of the object and then also mimicking, which I think is a lot of what we do, is like take the objects that have been around us and then actually recreate them.
Yeah, so we draw in a lot of different stuff, and some of it has to do with like our domestic situations, and then the other nice thing about the work that deals with found objects is it's useful to have that as a jumping off point for your work. Like the hardest place to start is like a blank canvas, right? Or a blank sheet of paper where you're trying to make something entirely new. It's great to have something come into your life that you can be like, oh, this is a starting point.
I also think that like there is this element of play with the objects we engage with on a daily basis. That is a really big part of our work, because especially with furniture. And I think maybe the furniture is like a interesting moment for me, because especially with working from home, which we had to do, initially through the pandemic. And it was like, suddenly it's not like you're going to a lot of different spaces each day. It's like, actually you're at home with your furniture. And then you're on Instagram thinking about, I really want a new couch, Yeah. And, but then you're sitting next to a pile of stuffed animals with your like old couch, and you can't seem to get rid of the stuffed animals. So, and I think that's where kind of playing with that whimsy of rethinking furniture kind of came to us, because these objects are actually really important. Like in a way, they are part of our lives every day. We engage with them. They serve a function. And then like, trying to think about that. And then a lot of the furniture that we do use and rework, if it's found furniture, is stuff that people were actually throwing away, or that was probably going to go to a landfill, but there's still an element of beauty to it.
And there's definitely a nostalgic element to a lot of the work too, where it's like this mirror piece on the wall here and that smaller piece in the frame. Those frames are from my mother's house when she was a kid. You get saddled with those kinds of things, which is both good and bad, like these commemorative heirloom things that you have to figure out what to do with.
So people like to come into our house and tell us that we have a lot of stuff. And I'm always like, really? Like, you think I have a lot of stuff? But then I find it very curious that the same people that tell me that I have a lot of stuff, and these are, mind you, friends and family. So, and then they like to then give us more stuff. Yeah. And I feel like a lot of times it's stuff that they actually feel guilty about getting rid of. And I really do feel like objects have some sort of ownership over us in a way that makes us feel a little bad when we get rid of them. Well, Aunt Susie gave me that, so it must have been really important to her. And I was like, was it really important to Aunt Susie? Like, was it? Or was she feeling guilty and gave it to you? And so I think that's where we really started to also explore that with the artwork, because, and especially using a lot of times this old and dusty or furniture that once was really elegant and really beautiful, and then putting it into this artwork where it's like it could have been thrown away, but now we've shifted its meaning and we actually recrafted it so it can be both beautiful and in some ways, and I also think disturbing. Like, I love to make things really grow on, accumulate on the piece of artwork so that it really does feel like, what is going on here? So it needs guilt feelings. The artwork should feel guilty. And I think that trying to give something a second life or to rework its value is also important to us, and then its meaning as well. So, so thinking in that regard, the interesting thing though for instance, with Vanity Vanitas, which is probably the largest and most complex piece that Nate and I have worked on, it's also a piece that actually is almost entirely fabricated by us. That one is very much thinking about this play between the domestic space and value, and then also because it has so many reflections, and also moments of transparency. It's really thinking about this screen culture that we're in. So,
like, how much do you show and how much do you reveal of the things that are intimate to yourself? And basically the idea being that it's a recreation of this kind of ghostly piece of furniture that would be intended normally as something that would not be a piece that was on display. This would be a piece for your private quarters, your bedroom, or something like that. And so, we were thinking about taking that and making, not only sort of making that kind of piece public, taking that out of the bedroom is reflected in the fact that it's transparent.
We also were mimicking a little bit of AI generated art in the design. So kind of upping some curves and like making it a little bit strange. It was very intentional. So it,
Yeah.
it's a lot going on. I think I'll be unpacking that piece in my brain for a long time. But I do think there is a relationship between the found furniture and the vanity, because there were moments where we thought that we were going to try to find a vanity similar to the one that we built completely out of glass and actually cobble glass components into it.
Yeah.
And so that would have been similar to how we work. But I do think that piece led a little bit to me wanting to create the work that's actually behind us, which also has a little bit of a whimsical feel to it. We've created our own wallpaper designs actually and used them in this exhibition. But with this one, I was trying to create actual dimensional wallpaper, like it's actually growing out of the wall. And then this chandelier above us is actually a chandelier that my grandmother brought with her from Florida from her condo. And it was a part of our wedding. It kind of traveled with us and got a little bit messed up. And so I actually had to rework all the parts to make it function again and clean it up. And it has some elements of glass that I've fabricated in it as well. So it kind of is this interesting, very personal piece related to that concept. So one thing we haven't really talked a lot about are the vacuum form pieces, which are actually pretty important to our practice now. It actually started in 2020 when we initially just decided to think about this idea of encapsulation. And we kind of did a vacuum form with clear plexiglass and black plexi acrylic over top of some pieces of left remnants of our practice that we just wanted to kind of create a composition.
It's mostly, I think, pieces of glass.
Yeah, some pieces of glass. And so we were thinking of that as like this kind of moment of consumerism where you get that package from Lowe's and you're trying to extract your tool or that toy and you're like, why is this plastic in my way? And it's also this interestingly shiny display case that they're giving to you in that consumerism way. And so we were kind of thinking about that as we started to encapsulate like pieces of our process within it. But then we just got a lot more experimental and started to push like how sharp the impression could be.
What the vacuum former allows us to do is like, as opposed to making something by hand or even making something using digital fabrication, it's an incredibly fast process. And basically, once you have your arrangement of whatever elements you want to put underneath it, the vacuum forming process takes 30 seconds. So that really allows us to make sculptural work in the mode of a printmaker or a photographer, where it's like you're going to take a lot, or you're going to either make a lot of additions or you're going to take a lot of photographs, and then you can go back through and self-select out the best ones, which is not a method that is normally available to sculptors, right? To do something like that by hand would be incredibly time consuming. And to scan something like that and carve it out on a CNC machine wouldn't be that much better. And the fidelity wouldn't be as good.
And keep in mind, it's not like we're just laying stuff out and boop, it happens. Like there's a lot of kind of careful consideration of like what's the theme of this piece? What are we thinking about? And a lot of them have objects from our lives or from our family, or kind of thinking about different topics of the day. So thinking about still lives and then thinking about these almost as like this combination between a still life and a portrait. So that we actually pull aspects of our lives into the pieces. And so there's a lot of symbolism with the objects and then thinking about how it's arranged. And so I think to me, they provide me, at least it's conceptually interesting, but also aesthetically engaging. And that's, I think, really their strength. And also that we can make them quickly when we want to. Yeah, I think we're really starting to think more about use of texture and how that also relates to objects in the home. And I think the vacuum form pieces are also at this point have been very monochromatic. And we actually introduced with this show, we started to utilize paint on them. And so they have taken on a little bit of a different life in that regard. And so one of the things that we think we're going to start exploring is like, do we start to actually make the objects within the piece have different, like we start to get more into almost like a painting? Like, does this really become a dimensional painting and not just a relief? And what does that do?
And can we do the same kind of like interventions with them that we do with the found objects, like putting the craft supplies, putting the bits of glass, stuff like that, back onto the top of the vacuum forms? And also, do they continue to exist just as plastic? Because, one of the traditional uses of the vacuum former is to make molds. And actually, if you were to flip the vacuum forms over, there's a very high fidelity mold of whatever we put onto that plate underneath. So there's an opportunity to make them more solid if we want to then carve into them, things like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of directions. I would say one other thing that we did with this exhibition that is maybe not necessarily new, but I think it's new for us. We actually we worked with the gallery to create a space for Vanity Vanitas. And so that space actually references an alcove that is actually in her home. And then we designed wallpaper that has elements of the garden that we had at our home in Columbus, that all of the flowers had gone to seed. And so that's not typically what you do with your vegetables. You don't let them usually go to seed. But we found that the flowers from those specific plants were actually quite gorgeous. And so Nate composed them into a pattern, and we kind of worked back and forth on the look and feel of it. And so that I think designing more wallpaper is in our future, especially wallpaper that's referencing different images and components of our lives and environments is important. So that's the future.